Thanks everyone for joining us. Good evening and welcome to the Book Club of California's online and in-person program titled City of Wood, San Francisco and the Architecture of the Redwood Lumber Industry. My name is Kevin Kosick and I'm the Executive Director for the Book Club of California, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here and host the program this evening. For those of you that are new to the Book Club of California, we are a nonprofit, member, and donor-supported organization that is dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes, we do that with focus on the history and the literature of California and the West. The book club publishes limited edition, finely made books. We have a scholarly journal called the Quarterly Newsletter, and we have keepsakes for our members. We host a year-round series of exhibitions and programs like the one this evening on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, California history, and much, much more. Now, if you're not a member of the book club, or if your membership has lapsed and you're interested in what we do, please consider joining our century-long tradition. Our membership dues are modest, the benefits are many, and we simply can't do the work of the book club without the support of our members. So I encourage you to go online to bccbooks.org to learn more about us, to join, or to donate. Now, tonight's program is titled City of Wood, San Francisco and the Architecture of the Redwood Lumber Industry. And our speaker is James Michael Buckley. Now, James Michael Buckley is an urban planner and an architectural historian. James is recently retired from the University of Oregon, where he was an associate professor and chair in historic preservation and the director of the Historic Preservation Program in the School of Architecture and Environment. He previously held teaching positions at MIT, San Francisco State University, and the University of California, Berkeley, where he earned an MA in city and regional planning and a PhD in architecture. He also holds a BA in art history and American studies from Yale University. Now tonight, Jim will talk about his book, City of Wood, San Francisco and the Architecture of the Redwood Lumber Industry. California's 1849 gold rush triggered creation of the instant city of San Francisco, a base to exploit the rich natural resources of the American West. Capitalists and workers logged the state's vast redwood forests to create the financial capital and construction materials needed to build the regional metropolis of San Francisco. That is the subject of tonight's talk. Now, if you have questions for our speaker, please wait till the end of the presentation. We will have time for a conversation with our speaker then. We'll take questions from the Zoom audience using the chat and the Q&A functions, and we'll take questions from you here in the club rooms. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, James Michael Buckley.
Thanks, Kevin, and thanks to the California Book Club for inviting me here, and thanks for all of you for joining me here and online. This book was a lot of fun for me to research and write. I learned lots of interesting things about the history of redwood lumber I can share with you tonight. I was also struck by how important the lumber industry was in California and in San Francisco in particular. Kevin, you just mentioned the instant city and the use of natural resources here in California. We know the world rushed in for the gold rush, but the gold rush sparked many other industries: foundries, agriculture, ranching, and lumber was actually one of the largest industries in California until into the 1900s. But you don't hear that much about it, and as I learned when I was researching this, there's not that much written about it. So it's exciting to be able to look at it and think about it. Tonight I want to go through some of the main points of the book so you can get a sense of how I put this all together. So why City of Wood? Well, the book has a very complicated thesis I'm going to lay on you right now so you make sure and get it. The thesis is everything is connected. Okay, that's not very complicated, but it's not something we think about that often, especially when we think about architecture and urban planning. When I looked into the redwood lumber industry, I learned that what was happening in the forest was always very connected to what was going on in San Francisco and vice versa. And it turns out that every redwood lumber company in the forest had a partner or an agent in San Francisco who helped plan and market the wood product. And wood products were made both in the forest and in San Francisco, or both. So it made me think about the dynamic as a sort of prelude to the globalization we think about a lot today, and the ongoing debates about how manufacturing links different places across space, and we don't think about that much. So the idea behind the City of Wood is that we should think about how the process of harvesting these giant trees was closely connected to the activities in the central city. And to understand this story completely, I ask you to imagine that the borders of San Francisco expand outward across Marin, across Sonoma, Mendocino, Humboldt County, all the way to the Oregon border. So that all of San Francisco and the Redwood Forest are included in one big urban complex. And I use the idea of an imagined city of wood as a device to look at all this activity and how their changes in the redwood lumber manufacturing in the forest changed what was going on in San Francisco and vice versa. I talked about three main places in the book. Of course, San Francisco. I look in particular at the redwood forest in Humboldt County, and I look at Eureka, the town of Eureka up there on the North Coast. And I look at vernacular architecture. I'm an architecture historian, but I'm really interested in everyday buildings and what they can tell us. And I felt that was very useful to look at what was going on with workers and labor in this industry, things we don't often think about because not a lot of workers write about their experience, but we can see some of the buildings and how they lived. So throughout the book, I look at what's called the production value chain of the lumber industry. And that just means all the processes that go into making a wood product, starting with chopping down the tree, to milling it into lumber in a sawmill, to making into a finished product like shingles or siding in a planing mill. And lumber companies were always moving around these pieces of the value chain to incorporate new technologies or to take advantage of situations with labor. And each shift in the value chain made a difference in what was going on in the urban environment in both the city and the forest. So why was redwood so important? We know it grows to over 300 feet tall, more than 20 feet wide in many cases. Old growth specimens can be more than 2,000 years old. But redwoods produce a special kind of lumber. They have a very long trunk with branches not until the very height in the crown, which means you can get a lot of boards that don't have knot holes, very important. It's a soft wood that's easily shaped, and it has tannins that resist insects and can retard fire. So this was so popular for building that most of the houses in San Francisco were built out of redwood, and we used up so much of it that we wound up tearing down about 95% of the original forest. I opened the book with my favorite building of the whole study, the House of Hoo Hoo. And I just like saying the House of Hoo Hoo too. This was a pavilion at the 1915 Panama Pacific International Exhibition in San Francisco for a national organization of lumbermen known as the Concatenated Order of Hoo Hoo. Now, as you might imagine, there's probably a lot of drinking going on in this group, and the head of the group is called the Snark of the Universe. So it's not that serious, but somehow they convinced the famous architect Bernard Maybeck to design a really crazy kind of clubhouse for them at the fair that looks like a Greek temple, but it has raw redwood tree trunks as columns, bark and all. And this clubhouse is basically a knockoff of the more former building that Maybeck designed for the fair, which of course is the Palace of Fine Arts, still standing in the Marine District. For me, this building highlights the theme of the book, which is that the lumbermen brought these redwood trees into the city, and it symbolizes the connection between the forest and the urban area. It's important to acknowledge that, like all industries in the American West, redwood lumber involved removing the native people, including the Hupa, Tolowa, and Yurok people who had lived in the forest for centuries and built homes like this one out of the forest and used it to provide food. This was a very horrible process in which European settlers removed Indians by force, including some really horrific massacres, and they resettled the survivors on reservations, I'm showing on the right the Hooper Reservation School in Humboldt County. But by 1850, many Americans who had struck out in the gold fields began to look for other opportunities, and these included lots of people with experience logging the pine forests in the Northeast. So you can imagine what someone who's used to logging in Maine or Nova Scotia, what they thought when they came to Redwood Forest, they saw more wood in a tree than they ever seen before. In the early years, most firms were partnerships of two men. One in the forest who supervised a crew of burly lumberjacks like these guys, and a very simple operation for a milling operation, and another partner who was in San Francisco who kept track of the market and supervised the loads of lumber that ships brought to San Francisco. Technology really changed the shape of the forest as it sped up production when companies began to build railroads that replaced the ox and horse teams that dragged the tree trunks across the forest. This was happening by the 1870s. And they introduced mechanical improvements like the Dole-Beard donkey, shown on the left, which is a steam pulley device that pulled the logs across the forest floor. This was invented by John Dole-Beard, hence the name Dole-Beard donkey. And I want you to remember that name because I'm going to come back to it in a couple of minutes. The redwood logs were so large that companies needed to constantly innovate to find ways to saw these trees efficiently. The Evans third saw added additional saws beside the main saw in order to cut out the portion of the log that would not fit into the regular saw assembly. And band saws were able to cut these very large trees because of their continuous circular pattern. As lumber companies grew and developed their sites in the forest, they established villages around the sawmills that were deep in the woods. These were usually haphazardly laid around the cookhouse with bunkhouses scattered around. In this case, we have the Jolly Giant Mill near Arcata. You can see the sawmill in the middle and various buildings around it. Another village up by Blue Lake has cabins scattered around the main shingle mill and a warehouse and general store right in the middle of things. We have a great description of these villages from Mabel Clausen, who was a reporter in the 1890s who visited several of these towns in 1893. She said, "These workers were not impolite, but ate as if they enjoyed their food and thought nothing of reaching across the table to help themselves to what they wanted." After lunch, she watched as the men blew a cloud of sacrificial incense to the goddess Nicotina. She proclaimed, "I do not remember seeing a finer set of men, all taken all together, than these hard-working lumbermen." Several lumber companies began to gather in Eureka, which was the main transshipment point for logs from the forest and lumber from the factories to be shipped to San Francisco because there were no railroads to San Francisco until 1914. And in Eureka, we meet a very interesting character in William Carson, one of the pioneer redwood lumber barons. And if you've been to Eureka, you know the Carson Mansion, which looms over the rest of the city. You can see it from everywhere. And it has so much Victorian gingerbread ornament that it was included in modernist architecture books as the kind of architecture to be avoided. William Carson was one of those lumbermen who came from the Northeast. He was from New Brunswick, to pan for gold and wound up logging the redwoods. He started by running the ox teams that brought logs out of the woods and set up his own mill in 1863 with a partner in San Francisco who was John Dole-Beard. So the Dole-Beard system was taken over by all the firms on the West Coast. John Dole-Beard became very rich and his partner, William Carson, became very rich as well, so we could build such a fancy house. We usually think about the Carson house, and you see it right here, all by itself as a picture of a very important piece of architecture. But what we don't realize is what we see here, which is the Carson house surrounded by the mill and by piles and piles and piles of lumber all the way around. So you can see that the house is in the red circle. This was taken by a balloon around 1900. Carson was the epitome of the old school lumberman who was very paternalistic towards the men. He wanted to keep the best men, so he treated them well. He knew them by name, by face. And And so he was very keen on having them be part of his work. And by working with maps and census data, I was able to find many of these workers. And I learned that many of them lived, here's the Carson house, and this is the neighborhood behind him. Many of them lived within the shadow of the mill in houses that he probably built on anyway. He was so kind to his workers that when he shortened the workday from 12 to 10 hours without being asked for it by his workers, his employees had a spontaneous march through town to his front porch where they serenaded him. So he was quite popular. Okay, almost all of the redwood lumber that was milled in Humboldt County was shipped by boat to San Francisco throughout the 19th century, along with lumber from the Sierras and from the Pacific Northwest. This is an image of a Redwood Lumber Company brochure from about 1920 that demonstrates that the people in this industry were very aware of the connection between the forest and the city, because in this case, it compares a redwood tree, a forest monarch, to a city giant, which is the Hobart building on Market Street, which is where that lumber company was located. And on the right, we see some of the lumber being unloaded at the docks in San Francisco. So in San Francisco, lumber shipments were located in two major areas of the wharves. Stewart Street on the top there in the early years, and later in the Mission Creek Lumber District all along the canal there. And we can see an example of Stewart Street and then the map of Mission Creek below it. Mission Creek was a vast lumber district, and you can see here that it was really in the top right corner, pretty much where the baseball park is today. The acres and acres of stacked lumber and several planing mills were located in this area that converted the raw lumber into the kind of gingerbread ornament that San Francisco was famous for. And the dark squares are planing mills, and all the kind of gray squares are stacks of lumber that were basically in streets. There were piles and piles all over this area. And you'll note a little bit to the left is the EK Wood Lumber Company. And here's the EK Wood Lumber Company. This is where they were in Los Angeles. But by good fortune, I found a diary of a man named Will Cordham, who came to San Francisco from Chicago just before the 1906 earthquake. And he worked in the lumber yard of the EK Lumber Company. And he described his setting. The office here is a small affair of which no window can be opened without producing a draft. And while the whole afternoon I have nothing to do, I am still required to remain inside and watch the telephone. Cordham found that the workers in San Francisco were a much more refined and educated class of people. Nearly all wear good clothes and stiff collars to work, leaving their overalls and boots behind. So we know the big industrialists in San Francisco like Levi Strauss, Adolf Spreckels, the big four railroad people. They were people who dominated their industry and they became well known. But we don't know that much about the people in the lumber industry here because there was too much lumber available and too many lumber companies for anyone to really dominate the market. So there's great competition all the time. We don't really know a lot of the founders. But I did find one interesting family, which is the Hooper family, who came from Maine in the 1850s and became very rich by logging, sawing, and selling redwood lumber. They had a sawmill in Humboldt County and planing mills in San Francisco. Here's the first home of John Hooper. As you can see, he was part of California's robust youth, says the book. He lived in this modest home on Rincon Hill near the wharves, like most of the manufacturers did at that time. He and his brothers were involved in lumber and mining, and they participated in the one big effort that was made to corner the market in redwood lumber in 1883, when they used capital from Scotland to buy most of the redwood timberlands in Humboldt County and most of the sawmills to form the California Redwood Company. And that was going swell until it was discovered that much of the timber was acquired through fraud. And the whole effort fell apart, but they never faced any crimes because most of the fraud was people coming up who weren't qualified and buying the timber on behalf of the lumber company. They also became wealthy by pioneering the distribution of their own brand of redwood lumber, the Excelsior brand, to retail stores they owned throughout Southern California. So people like John Hooper became so wealthy, they could buy a place in Pacific Heights like this one. was on Laguna and Clay. It's gone now. But like most wealthy industrialists, they moved from Rincon Hill to Pacific Heights. Johnny Hooper was the president of the First National Bank and made an immense fortune dealing in downtown real estate, including the property where Neiman Marcus is located now. His son, C.A. Hooper, helped develop the city of Pittsburgh in the early 1900s, building the Columbia Steel Mill and a huge redwood lumber manufacturing site that was on the Delta there. The Hoopers had a lot of property in the South of Market area, like this grain warehouse for wheat in the Central Valley that still exists. And there's a Hooper Street down by the California College of the Arts that bears their name. In the late 1800s, lumbermen like the Hoopers moved their offices from the lumber docks that William Cordham was describing to purpose-built office buildings downtown, helping to create San Francisco's central business district. And lumber companies like to be near each other so they could keep tabs on each other and share market information. So in this case, we can see letter A is the Dolbear and Carson Lumber Company. Just down the street was the Pacific Lumber Company, and next door was the John A. Hooper Lumber Company. And after the 1906 earthquake, the Hoopers routed again. They quickly built a new building on property they owned where the Embarcadero Center is now. And they invited the other lumber company firms to join them in the Lumbermen's building, which you can see very close to the ferry building. The heart of industry was the Soma district, of course, and had all kinds of manufacturing and all kinds of workers. In the book, I talk about where lumber workers lived in San Francisco, and I found many of the unskilled workers living in alley housing like this in the South of Market, some of which is still there. The skilled workers were able to move into the inner suburbs, like the Mission District, and they could afford single-family homes like this, while many of the unskilled workers who were part of the itinerant workforce who moved among various different jobs lived in single-room occupancy hotels like this one, no longer there. The Hugo Hotel was the defenestration art project, which had furniture flying out of it. So that's one example of the SROs south of Market. So the book really culminates in the first decade of the 20th century when the shape of the forest changed again because the redwood lumber industry was consolidated into three very large corporations that built huge vertically integrated sawmills like this one, Pacific Lumber Company's Mill A. This was built around 1910, and this is the smaller one. Mill B is even bigger than this one. So they're achieving a scale, a really big scale, and they were taking the finished production away from planing mills in San Francisco and making them in the forest. They found it more useful, more efficient to do all of the work in one mill. So by the early 1900s, these mills could cut as much as 600,000 board feet per day, which is about 30 times what was being done in the early part of the history of the redwood lumber industry. And they had payrolls numbering in thousands of people. This meant they had to hire many more workers. And as these firms moved into mass production, they each constructed a company town that would replace those informal mill villages I showed earlier. Company towns were a response to three factors. First was a threat of strikes by the industrial workers of the world, the IWW and other labor radicals. These towns represented an effort to encourage workers to be more loyal and to reduce turnover so firms could be more efficient. Secondly, the floating army of migrant labor in which people were moving around between different jobs in the agricultural and the railroad industry and the lumber industry, and they were trying to cut down on people who were doing that. And the migration of many workers from Southern and Eastern Europe, so we had many Italians and Greeks who were coming into the lumber industry at that time who had very different languages and customs. The best example of this is the elaborate lumber town of Scotia, which was constructed by the Pacific Lumber Company between 1910 and 1920. And the company used architecture and city plan to convince their workers to be good employees and not to move around. So in this case, we're looking at Scotia in the foreground. Mill B is the one closest to us. And if you pay attention, just across the river, there's a small village there. That's Wildwood, and I'll come back to Wildwood in a minute. But you can see the layout with kind of oriented the same way, Mill B at the bottom and Mill A at the top, and a very nice little town in between. Pacific Lumber developed a very cute little downtown for their village. They had many amenities that they built. They built a social club because they didn't want people drinking. There was no alcohol in the company town at that time. They had built a theater for their workers. They had a company store. And if you go across, they had the theater. Actually, where it says theater, that should be the bank. That's the bank building that they built, the First National Bank of Scotia, so that their workers would have a place to put their money. Here's the Wainema Movie Theater, where they showed pictures every week. And so employees had these pastimes they could do instead of socializing among themselves and, I suppose, causing trouble. They also built a very nice single-family homes in the hopes that workers would get married and settle down and stay with the company for a long time. This was another method of social control, and the company was very clear about this. The company manager said in a 1911 newspaper article, "Make your mill town beautiful. Get your men loyal and keep them so. Let this replace loyalty to a union. 10 good men will accomplish as much as 15 ordinary laborers if the spirit and goodwill is there." And a visitor in Scotia in 1913 described the effect this strategy seemed to be having on the local people. "I walked into Scotia on a Sunday morning 14 years ago, and I could see men under the influence of alcohol in all directions. I again walked into Scotia on a Sunday morning 6 months ago, and I could see well-dressed men with respectful countenances, pleasant and cheerful, and afterwards I learned that practically everyone had a bank account. I could see bright, neatly dressed children coming from Sunday school, men and women going to church or on their way to visit neighbors." It's a rosy view of it, but that was part of the point of having this kind of town. But as I mentioned, there was a town just across the river called Wildwood, known as Rio Dell today, and many of the workers preferred to live over there out of the company's reach. So here we see the Wildwood Pool Hall. It sounds like a music band, Trouble with a capital T. And we have a lot of bars, of course, gambling and other kinds of activities. So people look for that just outside the reach of the Scotia company. There was another company town, Samoa, which was across the bay from Eureka. This was owned by the Mean company owner. This was Andrew B. Hammond, who had built a fortune in lumber in Oregon, came down to California. He broke strikes both in the Humboldt County area and in San Francisco when the strikers were on in San Francisco. So he had some of the same amenities, but they weren't quite as nice. So he wasn't as willing to do quite the same things for the people that Pacific Lumber would do. So some interesting things happened as these corporations began to increase their output and increase the harvesting of redwoods. First of all, some people noticed that the increased pace of cutting was beginning to threaten the very existence of the old groves. Groups like the Sierra Club began to advocate for setting aside some of the most important areas, the ancient groves. And in particular, women's organizations helped expand concern about the loss of the redwood forest statewide as part of their growing interest in conservation. The Humboldt Federation of Women's Clubs organized a committee in 1913 to push for Redwood National Park. And here we see some people who were part of an effort in 1919 to campaign for bonds to buy some of that important area of the redwoods for new state parks. The other thing that happened was the companies themselves began to be interested in sustainability. They had spent so much on their workers and so much on their company towns, they realized they better have a supply of lumber well into the future to make sure they were going to pay that off. And so they began to embrace this new profession of industrial forestry, and they introduced sustained yield harvesting so they'd be assured of having raw material into the future. Most redwood companies introduced nurseries like this one, and they began to plant seedlings to reforest the areas they had cut. And Pacific Lumber was actually one of the leaders in this effort. Yeah, nice. I don't take My story passed the Depression, but you probably know the rest of the story. Most of the remaining firms were bought up into consolidations by Southern firms from Georgia Pacific and Southern Pacific, Louisiana Pacific. But Pacific Lumber survived into the late 20th century as a family-owned firm, only to be undone by the very thing that they did in sustainability, because a junk bond trader bought the firm and tried to financialize all the forest that they had saved over time. That didn't turn out very well for Pacific Lumber, but Scotia is still there and you can go visit it still. After World War II, there was a big boom in redwood lumber manufacturing because of new uses like decks and pools and particle board. So there was a renewal of interest in redwood lumber until the Redwood Wars in the 1990s, the fight over the Headwaters Forest, Julia Butterfly sitting in a redwood tree for a long time. And today we're left with only about 120,000 of the original 2.2 million acres that was the redwood forest, only about 5%. So as you can see, my theme is everything is connected. It shows that the destruction of the redwood forest shaped San Francisco in many ways and vice versa. This imaginary city of wood that I've concocted shows that what is taking place in the hinterlands is connected to what's happening in the metropolitan center and vice versa as well. We can construct a lot of different cities of San Francisco, a city of gold, a city of oil, a city of dot-coms. Currently, we have a city of AI. All of these are ways in which the industry creates the city and connects spaces over time. And for me, I think we can look at the ordinary environment, the ordinary architecture, to see what's going on and how people construct their lives in various conditions. So for me, this is a historical prelude to today's global industry, where things are made in one part of the world and people are used by people on the other side of the earth. So the idea is to think about how we think about those connections and understand how the environment come from. So I'll stop there and hope that you have a lot of questions or arguments or whatever you might have. Thank you.
I was waiting for one more slide, but that's okay. Okay. So yeah, let's take some questions. We'll start here in the front.
Okay, can you expand on what brought about the demise of Pacific Lumber? I know it was I vaguely remember some skullduggery,
Skullduggery, good word.
but I can't remember the particulars.
Well, the basic outline was they were doing very well. They were selling lots of redwood lumber products. And in the 1880s, you may remember, was when the idea of junk bonds came up. And one of the people who invented this concept bought Pacific Lumber precisely because he knew they had this stock of redwood trees that would last supposedly into perpetuity. And he realized if he borrowed a lot of money through junk bonds, he could pay it back quickly by selling off and cutting all of those redwood trees. That set the alarm off. And that set all the people coming up saying, no, you can't do this. We want our redwood forest forever. We want you to make redwood products, but we want to save the forest. So that's really what set it off, brought in the people from Humboldt County and elsewhere that tried to protect the redwood forest, and the rest is history.
We have another question? Back. Yeah, here.
But was the Carson House made of redwood, and did those guys have an affinity for the trees that they were involved with?
Interestingly, the Carson House was made of many different kinds of wood. The basic structure is redwood, but he had so much money, he could have exotic woods imported from South America. If you ever get inside, there's a lot of incredible, delicate ornament in there, that much of it is in these exotic woods. So it's very much a pattern of different kinds of woods. The redwood lumber barons did not really think about this until they started to think about, we're going to need wood well into the future. So that's when they became more converted. And in fact, I found one redwood lumber company owner who joined the group that was trying to protect the forest land in about 1920, because I guess he had a conversion experience and said, no, we want to do this. So we began helping them combine this over. Yeah.
I was curious, since a lot of the lumber was here in San Francisco, have you either encountered or know what kind of homes have been built in San Francisco out of Redwood? Is there a way of tracking that? Because there'll be homes of certain ages that most likely were and they're still around, right?
I'll bet you that 80% of the houses in San Francisco built before 1910 were built out of redwood. It's just so common. It's there. It easier to use than pine. So we had a lot of pine coming from the Sierras and from Washington, Oregon. But redwood was so easy to use, so prevalent that it really makes up most of the houses, whether they're single family homes or townhomes, but a lot of them really were made out of redwood.
My home in Alameda is Redwood.
And Jose Albion Oakland, absolutely, right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What age is yours?
1896.
Okay.
And mine's 1911.
Yeah, and I'm gonna say,
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah, my
You have to
parents. all-
remember most of it from
Yeah,
Right.
a good part of it.
There's a great question on Zoom about company towns
Mhm.
and how successful they were or weren't about keeping those employees happy with all of the, things that they created for them.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit more about
Well,
that.
it appears they did very well. In doing my research, I was interviewing people that grew up in these company towns. And that, to a person, they said it was a great place to grow up. There were things to do, the neighbors were friendly, it was great. So I feel like I got this sense that there are two kinds of people in the world. Those that like the army and those that don't. I felt a lot of people just had an affinity for that. Things are taken care of. They knew what was going to happen the next day. They had a lot of things to work with. They weren't rebels. So maybe the rebels were the ones that were across in the Wildwood, or they didn't sign up for that kind of thing at all. But I think they were very successful until the changes in the redwood lumber industry and the depression really changed the whole tenor.
So you're saying that Scotia still exists as a town?
Yes.
And this is a stupid question, but is Redwood grown anywhere else besides Humboldt County, other parts of the world?
So the coast redwood is only grows in that narrow band I showed you in the early slide, about 30, 40 miles wide within spitting distance of the ocean. That's what makes the coast redwood work. Another kind of redwood are the sequoias in the Sierras that are really the world's biggest trees because they have the most mass. And there's a third kind of redwood that grows in China called the dawn redwood. So really those are the only kind of redwoods that we find. It's a very specific location. Yes. Yes, and we didn't really think about it until they were almost gone. So it's a very tragic story.
So given that the redwoods are here in Northern California, there's many homes. There's one on Zoom that mentions their home in Southern California was built with redwood. And their garage at a different home was also redwood. How did they get the redwoods down there?
So that's why I was so impressed with the Hoopers. They figured it out. Everyone's gonna like redwood. So after they shipped the redwood to San Francisco, they shipped it down and they had a huge plant down there in Southern California. And I mentioned Andrew Hammond. He went the next step. He had huge planing mill operations in San Pedro and Huntington, and he had retail outlets all around in Southern California. So they found a way to bring this very nice wood to people. And again, Southern California made use of it as well as Northern California.
John.
So
No.
you may know that Bernard Maybeck, great architect, had something like 2,000 acres up in somewhere in North Sonoma County and beyond that he owned. He owned that red.
I did not know that.
And I don't know the exact tale, but that's one small one. I have a house in Berkeley built in 1905, and the structural members are all red cedar. Now,
Interesting.
that's something you would know about in Oregon. That was really the range you were, and that I think also can, because it is much stronger than red. Red structurally is not strong,
Yeah, redwood is good for workability.
and it's
And
also
they're,
great for facing.
yes, so that's why siding, shingles are the kind of thing that redwood are very popular for. But yes, cedar is stronger in that way. So it's another alternative.
Over here, yeah.
You mentioned your interest in vernacular architecture. I was wondering, are there any unique kind of floor plans, buildings that emerge in San Francisco or in Northern California that are kind of tied to type of construction?
I haven't found anything that is particularly associated with redwood. They're building the kinds of houses that they're going to build anyway, that just like using redwood lumber for it. And in the mill villages and the company towns, again, they seem to be pretty standard arrangements of how worker housing would be. So there's nothing about the redwood material that seems to be making them build the houses in a kind of different way. Good question, though.
I think there was another question. Yeah.
Well, a couple of recent questions have sort of opened the door to this. Going back to your map early on.
Yeah.
Coastal map.
Yeah.
Comments you made about that, and someone's asked a follow-up. Is your book really focused only on the coastal redwood market, or do you also discuss redwood to the degree it came or did not come into the Bay Area from the Sierra Nevadas?
I only do the coast redwood, and I really only look at Humboldt County because I needed to narrow it down. And I make assumptions that it was similar in other parts of Mendocino, Del Norte counties. I don't look at the sequoias at all because that's a different kind of use of wood and a whole different delivery system for that kind of wood.
Then if I could ask a follow-up
Yeah.
question, you referred to San Francisco as being really the key market for the coastal redwoods. But to what degree was that timber used to build these other smaller towns up and down the coast? Do you get into that in your research?
It's interesting that often, because there's no railroad, the lumber, the plain lumber is shipped to San Francisco and then shipped to other places. So you might get an order on the wharves in San Francisco and someone asks for it in Napa to build a house. So it's shipped up the river or it's shipped by rail from there. Part of the whole issue is that you can't easily ship redwood lumber by rail until much later, 1914. And that's part of the reason redwood began to lose out in the market, because the big mills like Weyerhaeuser up in Washington had direct access to eastern markets with the rail. And San Francisco, Humboldt County didn't have that. I mentioned the Hooplers. The facility they built in Pittsburgh was actually designed to do that. The ships would come up, it's a deep water harbor, and they had rails right there. So they were trying to make that same kind of connection to be able to make the redwood lumber into finished products and then put it on rails and try and get to the East Coast. But redwood never really caught on the same way on the East Coast as it did in the West.
Smaller California cities and towns.
Yeah, they definitely used redwood lumber, but my point is that it generally came through San Francisco, not directly to those places. Yeah, yeah.
Lance.
I recently took a bunch of seniors over to Mill Valley, to look at the old railroad. And I did a little research in the background and discovered that in the population of Mill Valley was 32,000. And it's never changed. It in 19, when was the earthquake and fire? 1906. So when that occurred, a whole lot of San Franciscans had nowhere to live because it's burned just flat to the ground. So they came over and settled in Mill Valley because they had a summer house there or something. And so I was just wondering, the rebuilding of San Francisco was an enormous effort. I heard they had to go up to, Northern California, Oregon, even Washington, get lumber because they needed so much. So did you come up with a similar?
Yes. So redwood was just one of the woods available in San Francisco. And as you mentioned, Washington, Oregon, the Sierras were all sending lumber this way as well. Redwood was very popular for house construction, but they used pine and Doug fir and other woods, cedar, for uses as well. So all that was coming in the whole time, and redwood was in competition with those other kinds of woods. Now, interesting, Mill Valley had the first sawmill on the West Coast, about 1840. So they were already aware of that source, and they were trying to make use of it early on.
Yeah,
Cortamira means.
Cortamira means cut to wood.
I was really intrigued with the industrial uses of redwood. I was wholly ignorant. But the reason Northern California come into existence was we brought water from the Sierras, Southern California, St. Roseville. And those all came through aqueducts that were built in redwood. And there were 5 transcontinental railroads built, 5. Each of them required redwood ties, millions of them. So I'm not even sure that residential, commercial structures took the majority of this wood,
Just part of it.
because the wood was used for railway trestles, docks, piers, landings, all of them.
One of the biggest things that the brochures from Redwood companies around the 1900 were for tanks and pipes. That was really the major use for them. And I had an argument with my editor because he said, they didn't use redwood for railroad ties. Yes, they did. So yes, that's absolutely correct. There's a lot of different non-residential uses for lumber as well.
Winery tanks.
All right, yeah.
Winery.
Winery tanks.
Um,
The Corbell, I just mentioned Corbell, you know that the winery, they had a planing mill in San Francisco where they were taking lumber, redwood lumber. And
Oh.
that's good.
All water tanks.
All kinds of water tanks. The ones up in Mendocino that, yeah.
It's just a comment. I thought that that one slide of the Hobart building and the tree was really. We can stand and look at redwood tree, but when you get a piece of architecture that you know, you recognize what a remarkably special tree that is.
They had a good marketing person at that company because they realized, hey, our building's as big as a redwood tree. That'll be impressive. And it was.
Yeah,
Yeah.
really,
really.
it was quite.
Yeah.
It put a point on things.
Yeah. It's great.
We'll take one last question from Peter.
Well, let's see.
Make it a good one.
Wonderful mapping of the industry. Yeah, here on the West Coast.
I'm nervous because Peter's a geographer and a lot of my work is in geography. So
That's the hardest question.
I know,
Save it for the
I
end.
know.
Okay.
The year after I went down to teach at Cabrillo College in San Francisco, the geography department there in 1965, no, it's 1965. The next year, I bought 2 acres with an old farm and a farmhouse and a barn. Farmhouse, which I got and restored over 20 years, right? Was entirely redwood. Of course, Santa Cruz did have a small redwood industry here and did ship to some extent. It's pretty small.
Through Redwood City. That's another name, right? So that's where they were shipping the redwood from Santa Cruz.
Yeah, Santa Cruz shipped actually out of Santa Cruz itself. Some redwood.
Yeah.
Up here, not much. However, that whole house, which I found a farmhouse, which I was built in originally in 1886. All right, it was entirely redwood, and I restored the whole thing. One of the first things I did was put it on modern concrete foundations. The original foundations were mud sill, and the whole house was built on 14 by 14 redwood logs. Set in trenches.
Right.
Wow.
And then, of course, all the rest of the house going up is redwood as well, and beautiful structure, but it had to be reinforced a number of different places. And of course, the problem was that it had been painted, all the redwood trim and everything, beautiful redwood molding, had been painted over several times. And in the removal of that with Chasco paint remover, some of you may remember that, and power sanding without mass. That's why I have.
Oh,
this
okay.
condition.
We'll be careful working.
But
with it.
it-
That's
they wanted
great.
a Place to grow. I chose
Terrific.
it, and I still had 2 acres, put it in a small vineyard. Originally, it was an apple orchard, and eventually opened up Apple Lane Inn, a B&B there, and
That's great.
allowed me to do many things in the community.
That's great.
With Redwood, say the Redwood League.
Thanks, Peter. That's great.
Do you want to make any parting remarks or comments to sum us up and wrap it up?
No, I think
Nope.
that's it. The whole story right there.
That's the whole story. That's the whole Redwood story.
That's right.
So please join me in thanking our speaker. I'm gonna tilt on camera here and say goodbye to people on Zoom. Thank you, everyone, for joining us here in the club rooms and for joining us out there on Zoom. You can register for any book club event online at bccbooks.org/programs. Thanks again for being here. Thanks again to our speaker, Jim Buckley. We look forward to seeing you at the book club sometime soon. Thanks, everyone.